about, I guess, 15 years ago, when I was first promoted from a director in my organization to a managing director in my organization, one of the things they did was they put us through a leadership assessment. And this was one of those 360s where they interviewed your peers and your managers and your staff members, and they put it all together and they gave you scores out of 5 on a variety of different topics. I'm actually going to share you the actual topics because I have saved every single assessment that I have ever been through. So I have like a huge personal folder that's like this big with everything in it. So I'm going to share with you what the actual criteria were in it. But going back to that, I took a look at it a couple years ago. And I was trying to think, and by the way, I work with a lot of organizations that have their own frameworks, and even my own organization changed that framework over time. So there's so many different examples of when you're moving to that, what I call the executive level, what are they really assessing? And so I spent some time looking at a variety of different leadership assessments for that level from client companies and from other companies I had worked with and for, and the kind of versions that had changed over the years. And I kind of narrowed it down to a few key questions. So I'm going to share those with you. The second thing I had in my folder was I then had the assessment that had been done several years later, 5 years later, when they were trying to assess my senior management potential. So in the organization that I grew up in, once you became a managing director, that was your last promotion ever because there's no title above that. The only thing that then happens is you get bigger roles within that, and you eventually move to what we called was the board, or a lot of people call it the management committee or the operating committee of the firm. So here I was as now a managing director for 5 years, and they were trying to assess what was my potential to be able to move up to that next level, to be able to run a large global organization. And I have the criteria that they did in that assessment. And that time they actually hired a third-party firm. So we had a outside consulting firm. They're a recruiting firm, one of the big 5. Recruiting firms that that has its own practice in this space, and they hired them and they did the same 360, but also with their own filters and analyses in terms of particularly around what was our experience base, and in order to be able to move to a more senior executive level. So to make that transition from executive to senior executive. So I'm going to share that with you. Again, I have distilled what the key questions were that over time we've been looking at whenever we're trying to make that move, to move someone up to a management committee level. So I'll share that with you. And then the third thing that happened was once I had already moved to that level, I was at an organization, and this is post the financial crisis in banking, where we had a relationship with our regulator that they required that the top 65 people in the firm all go through a very detailed assessment. So this was something that was actually required by a regulator, and it was done by a third party. And it was both to validate us in the roles that we had, so to make sure that we had the knowledge that we needed of the role, but more so they were really looking at your leadership framework. So they were really trying to assess your capability as a leader. And what happened to me in that leadership session when that manager finally walked in, the consultant finally walked in, the external coach, to give me my results. And she said, listen, Elizabeth, like there is behind this framework, there's like a dozen things on this list, but behind it were hundreds of questions that we asked all of these individuals that had been working with you over the last dozen years. And I have to be honest, you have checked every leadership box. Like you've hit the boxes. You're a great leader. You're inspirational. People love working with you, for you. Your bosses talk as if you lead them. Like you've just done a great job leading. I really don't have much to offer you in terms of developmental feedback. And so at the time, I thought you would think that you would be really flattered by that, right? And maybe a small piece of me was, but more so, I was really outraged and disappointed because I felt, well, wait a minute. I'm not the most senior person in this organization. I have peers that certainly get paid more than me and are certainly considered more senior. They have either bigger divisions or divisions that produce more revenue or whatever it might be. So how can this be it? How do you have nothing else to offer me? I said, what do those people have that I don't have? And she knew me for a bit at this point, and she just smiled and looked at me and said, the only thing they have that you don't is they never ask that question. And it was the first time in my career that it finally hit me after all of this work of going through all of this leadership assessments and frameworks and making sure that I checked all of these boxes. All of these dozen lists and items were really just about the high level questions, and that I didn't need to be over engineering it. What she really said to me was, if you want it, just go for it. Especially at the point where you've done all this work. You don't need to get to be the 100% check the box on the leadership framework. Good is good enough. If you can make it to that point and you want it badly enough, that will do it. That will move you to the level that you want to get to. So I would say that probably my most insightful leadership message came to me fairly late in my career, but now you get to benefit from all of that wisdom and experience. And with that, I'm going to share with you now the leadership framework. I do want to show you the leadership assessments that I was first started with, my level 1 assessment, which was to go through to the executive level. And what you can see here, right, is it was, okay, financial and business. Do I create value for the client? Do I understand clarity and execution of our strategy? Financial and business performance of the group that I was in charge of. Operational excellence, leading people. Can I motivate, engage, inspire, foster diversity, build a performance culture? And of course, franchise building. But the truth is, when I look back at all these assessments, what they really want to check when you're moving to executive level is, how well do you know your organization? I could probably say actually organization / industry. How well do you know yourself? So how in tune are you with your own skills, your own strengths, your own developmental opportunities, how you're perceived by others? Because one of the things they did in this assessment was your self-assessment versus how others rated you. And it was amazing to see sometimes where people would say, they would give you all 5s and you give yourself a 3, or the reverse would happen. You give yourself 5s and people would give you a 3, and you think, do I not know myself? So that was one of the things they assessed for people, was what your gap was in terms of were you well aligned with what other people rated you? So how well do you know yourself? And have you carved out a leadership role in the organization for yourself? This is really all that I needed to know at this level. How well do I know my organization and my industry? How well do I know myself? And have I carved out a leadership role? Now, in the process of carving out a leadership role, you will, of course, develop a lot of the things over on the left-hand side. But the idea of having to do a detailed assessment of those things is a lot less important than it is to actually know whether or not you have built a leadership profile of yourself, or you've carved out a role that you're able to actually find an opportunity to be a leader, to be seen as a leader, and actually get to lead. So that's my level 1 advice. Level 2, this was to move to senior executive. And here, there were some really interesting technical points. And I know I've mentioned some of these to some of you before, which is they were really looking very specifically at our explicit growth experiences. So had I managed large teams, had I led transactions, had I led a P&L, actually had full responsibility for a P&L, had I had a primary expat experience, so not just running a global organization, had I lived in multiple countries, that was very essential to them in terms of being able to move to senior executive level. Again, I was at a global organization, so it mattered a lot. And had I had leaps in size and scope, so over the years, had my business grown and my functional responsibilities grown either in scope or in size dramatically in major leaps. So did I get thrown into the deep end, right, and have to swim and tread water and get to the other side? That's an experience that they value much more, those step function changes, as opposed to just like easing into senior management. They're really looking for, have you been challenged with major leaps in size and scope? And then business experience, similarly, have you built a business, grown a business, restructured a business, transferred a business, or had a strategic project or initiative? So by this point, I had completely integrated a new company into, we bought a company that was twice the number of people and a completely different business. It was a Main Street business that we were bringing into a Wall Street business. And I became not just the COO for that business, but I actually ended up running that business for the corporate parent. So it had its own CEO and president, but I represented it in corporate headquarters. So it gave me a chance to actually operate a business before I had never had that responsibility. Then it moves into your function expertise, right? So, diversity across businesses and clients and products, asset classes, that you've actually switched between line or staff roles. I had at one point in my career, I worked for the chief risk officer of the bank. And he had started his career in risk 25 years earlier. And at one point he said something, he said, well, when I was running this business, and I said, well, wait a minute, what are you talking about? When did you run a business? You've been in risk. And he said, oh, no, I started in the risk organization as a credit risk officer. I moved all the way up. They pulled me out to run one of our businesses, and then they brought me back into risk, and now he's chief risk officer. And by the way, they had sent him to Asia as well in that time frame. So clearly, in terms of growing a senior manager, those were two of the most important things they did, was that they pulled him out of his core function, gave him a completely new area of responsibility, and also put him in a different region. And then what are your competencies? So the basic questions here, though, are, have you had explicit growth experiences? Have you developed core leadership competencies? You need core leadership competencies. What you don't need is necessarily to check the entire framework like I felt I had to. And can you use those experiences to elevate your leadership? So are you able to then say, okay, based on all the leadership skills that I do have, the experiences that I have, can I put those two things together to really move to the next level of leadership? Can I demonstrate that I can take those step function leaps in order to manage something bigger? And honestly, the answer for all of you is always yes, you can. Because at another point in my career, when I was considering a major step function role change, I sat down with my boss at the time, and I had created a list for him. I said, these are the 10 things that I think I need to do this job, that had been offered an internal move, this job well, and I only have 5 of them. And so he says, let me see the sheet. And so I ripped it out of my notebook and I passed the sheet, and I had 10 things with boxes, and I had check marks in the 5, and then I had 5 I hadn't checked. And he looked at the sheet and he crumpled it up and he tossed it across the room. And I said, well, what are you doing? What are you doing? He says, you're kidding me. What he actually said was, he said, a man would never do that. And so just the gender stereotype there. He said, why do you think you need all of those 10 things in order to do the job? The fact that you even have 5 of them is amazing. Like, you jump into a book and start reading a book without knowing how it's going to end. So this is your book, and you already have 5 chapters read. You're jumping in at chapter 6. This is awesome. You're perfectly capable of taking this job. It's not about whether or not you can take it. It's about whether you want to take it. So let's spend the entire time, we spent 2 hours, let's spend the entire time talking about how you think you would enjoy it, whether you would learn, whether you would grow. And it was an amazing interaction, particularly given he actually didn't want me to leave. He actually wanted me to stay in the role that I was in. But I think just sitting across the table from him with my little pathetic list, I think he actually took pity on me and said, oh my gosh, she needs to jump in at chapter 6. So I'm the heck with it. I'd rather lose her and see her achieve than sit here and try to convince herself how she ends up, how she would like working for me more. I think he was hoping that I would say, no, I'm not going to like working with those people as much as I like working with you, which was partially true. But the opportunity to jump in on chapter 6 and figure out how to build the rest of the book myself was too good to turn away. So there you go, leadership level 2. Leadership level 3, and they keep adding more and more things. I won't go through all of them. This is the one that they did when I was at senior executive level. And here, it was much more about aligning teams to the vision, right? Making judgments, both for clients and for shareholders. So really being able to not just do, but to be able to think and really have that good judgment, right? You always start hearing when we start talking about future leaders, it's like, oh, I don't know, the judgment skills. They just don't exercise good judgment. This is just essential. Inspirational. Had I now built a real brand, a leadership brand for myself? Was I good at both execution, but leading people? Entrepreneurial leadership, even though I was in a big corporate environment, right? They want to know that you can build talent, that you can actually fast track other senior people and other talent pools, and that you're willing to sponsor mobility so that you're willing to transfer people, right? I gave up more than not. Once I got to the executive level, I gave up my best person every other year. I just said, or at least I would offer them to leave. So I would say, it's time for you to do something different. I think you should go look at that. And sometimes they decided they wanted to stay and I would add more responsibility to them. But more than not, I was always pushing my best people out. I just felt that if I sponsored them within the organization, it would come back to me in droves, that I would end up with other people's best talent. And then relationship leadership. In terms of collaboration, right? I got to the point when I got to that senior executive level where so much of what I was doing was figuring out what my peers needed. So really sitting down and saying, okay, I was this chief operating officer of one division. Let me look at the COOs for the other 6 divisions and let me think about what they need. And there was, I remember one time, an operating committee of the bank. So all the COOs sitting around the table with the COO of the bank. We all had a dotted line reporting relationship to him. And the HR person was fighting for budget dollars for a program and was getting killed. Like there was no way she was going to get her budget. As a matter of fact, it wasn't even the COO for HR, it was the head of HR. And I jumped in and I said, here's why I support that. I know it will mean that I might not end up with as much budget, but here's why I think this is really essential to what we're doing in the organization right now. And I listed my 3 points of support. I had one other peer who jumped in to support her. And then the COO said, money's got to come from somewhere. What are you willing to give up? And so you end up always with those zero-sum games. But I definitely developed a profile as someone who was willing to think more broadly than just my own interests and really think about the entire organization. And that's what they're looking for when you get to that senior executive level. So the key questions here: can you operate at the firm-wide level, right? And if you're right now running a team or running a division, or thinking about taking a role where you're running a team or running a division, you also want to make sure that you have line of sight to what the bigger organization looks like and what operating at a bigger level might be. So it might be your team within a division, or if you're in a divisional role, then it might be thinking about the organization more broadly. But every time you want to move to the next level, it is so much about thinking about what's the broader organization around me trying to accomplish, and can I operate at that level? Second, when you get to this level, you need to be able to lead leaders. So it's not just about managing people, and it's not just about managing individuals. It is about leading leaders. And interestingly enough, one of the ways I worked on this skill was to manage my boss, and to manage people that were more senior than me. So sometimes it was peers that maybe we reported to the same person, but they were more tenured or more senior or at a higher level. But I figured out, if I only had a team, right, if I had a staff level team that they weren't managing, if I had a flat organization and they weren't yet managing, I was always looking for the opportunity to figure out where could I manage people who were managing. And it just turns out that my boss was usually the person I ended up trying to lead. So I worked on figuring out how to offer them constructive feedback in terms of their leadership style, in terms of how they were managing me, and in terms of how I observed them managing other people. And that's that takes a lot of courage, and it takes a lot of vulnerability. You're offering a lot of vulnerability there when you try to manage your boss, particularly if you don't want them to know you're doing it. But it was one of the key places where I actually practiced. So if you don't have, you could think about that in terms of other individuals, whether it's your boss or whether it's someone who is more senior, that you have the opportunity that you're either working with them on a project or whatnot, to see whether or not there's an opportunity to actually practice your style of leadership with them. It definitely helps you grow and learn. And then the final thing when you get to senior executive level is you just have to be known for it. So it's one thing to say, sure, I can operate at the firm-wide level and I can lead leaders, but you need to actually be known for it. And I remember when I was interviewing internally to go work for the chief risk officer at the bank. So that would have been a step function move for me. It was a big promotion because I was on the operating committee of the entire bank. And I said, why did you pick me? Why am I on your short list? And he said, well, you're known as one of the top COOs in the organization. And I said, well, thank you. I appreciate that. Do you know why? What about me makes me one of the top COOs in the organization? And he said, why don't you tell me? And so I listed a few things, but one of the things I said, I make my bosses really successful. I make them better at what they do. And and I develop a very high trust relationship with all of my peers and with my bosses. And that's one of the reasons why I have such a strong reputation around the organization. And he was like, yes, I knew that. But so I'm not sure whether or not I hadn't done a good enough job making sure he knew what the answer to the question was, but I knew the answer to the question. I was ready to present him with the answer to the question. The other thing I said to him was, I said, so if that's not what you're looking for, if you're not looking for someone that's going to partner with you at a level where we will co-manage, then I might not be the right choice for you. Because I do push my bosses. I do help make them better. If you succeed, I succeed. And I knew that was part of my personal brand. I knew that he could call up my last 3 bosses and ask them that, and they would say, oh yeah, that's definitely her. That's what she does. And that's part of how she became who she is in the organization. So know this for yourself, right? You need to be able to operate at that firm-wide level. You need to be able to lead leaders, but you have to know that the rest of the organization is able to recognize it. And think about what I gave you the example for me, but think about what it looks like for you. So those are my leadership assessments. Again, remembering the caveat that I started with, which was when I got to the very end and did my final assessment, she pretty much said to me, I had over-engineered it. I didn't need to always have all 10 chapters checked. I really needed to make sure that I had the core skills, that I had the right experiences along the way, and that I was constantly building my profile and brand, one that I knew and that I was comfortable with. It wasn't about making sure that I had checked. I even have it, I should have put it in the presentation, which was like a 8x8 matrix of our leadership framework, with all these tiny little skills that you were supposed to master. I shared some of the best ones here. It wasn't about that checkbox exercise. It was about a much broader